The story of the young Perceval belongs to the worldwide fairy tale motif of the simpleton, in which it is precisely the youngest or seemingly most foolish brother who repeatedly succeeds in performing the great deed or in winning the treasure that is difficult to obtain. Like many fairy tale heroes, Perceval grows up in a forest. With its plant and animal life, its dim light, and its limited horizon, the forest aptly portrays the still barely conscious condition of the child, who remains close to nature. This primitive situation is further emphasized by the fact that Perceval grows up without a father and knows only his mother, who raises him in solitude, far removed from the world. Understood as a protecting and nourishing realm, the forest also represents the all-embracing quality of the mother. In this way, the original state of any life lived within the orbit of the mother is presented in a twofold image. The important role played by the mother figure in this tale becomes clear in what follows. The choice of such a remote dwelling place shows that Perceval's mother wished to shield her son from the dangers of the world, and especially from the perils of knighthood, to which both his father and his brothers had fallen victim. Behind this seemingly reasonable explanation, however, something far more profound is concealed: the problem of mother and child, which is as fundamental as it is universal, and which is already present in the original situation itself. This problem belongs to every human being from the very beginning of life, and is of such weight and significance that people in all places and in all ages appear to have felt compelled to confront it, not only outwardly in lived reality, but also inwardly by portraying its many aspects in myth and fairy tale. Modern psychology has likewise recognized the central importance of this problem, and has examined its effects on human development. These investigations make clear that the issue cannot be reduced to merely personal circumstances, but points instead to universally inherited, archetypal situations and patterns of behavior. Before turning to broader considerations, attention is first directed to the personal aspect, which most readily illuminates the problem. Perceval's mother wished to keep him under her care, far removed from worldly influences, and to preserve him from danger and suffering. This attitude corresponds to a basic instinct found even among animals, often described as the instinct to protect the young in the nest. Such protection is essential as long as the child is helpless and dependent on maternal care. When, however, the mother clings to this attitude longer than necessary, the child's development may be hindered or even blocked. The outcome is especially unfortunate when the child is timid and fearful by nature, for instead of daring to step into life, he prefers to remain within the safety of the maternal circle. Such bonds to the mother play a significant role in certain neurotic conditions. Freud interpreted these states as being rooted in unconscious or repressed incest wishes, which, in his view, give rise to what he termed the Oedipus complex, and to which he assigned central importance. Incestuous images or situations that appear to support this interpretation do indeed sometimes emerge in dreams. Jung, however, explained in Symbols of Transformation that the longing for the mother may also be understood in a different sense. He did not see it solely as an infantile, neurotic, or regressive craving, but pointed instead to the wealth of symbolic material suggesting a hidden urge toward rebirth and the transformation of the personality. From this perspective, the discussion moves toward the transpersonal significance of the mother. Viewed in this way, she is less a specific individual than the universally present giver and preserver of life. In this sense, she may be compared to the unconscious, which stands as the source and origin of all psychic life. Like the personal mother image, the transpersonal one also possesses a negative aspect, expressing a tendency to hold the child back. In myths and fairy tales, this aspect is often represented through images of killing or devouring the child. For this reason, Jung speaks of the terrible or devouring mother. In mythology, this figure appears as a fearful and destructive goddess, such as the Indian Kali, while in fairy tales she emerges as the cruel stepmother or the witch. These figures embody the death aspect of Mother Nature, who from time to time destroys her own offspring and takes them back into herself. In a corresponding manner, the unconscious exerts an influence by opposing the development of consciousness, or by threatening to dim or even extinguish the hard-won light of awareness. Archetypal images are in fact already present in the psyche as structural forms of instinct before individual consciousness arises. For this reason, the child's world consists less of ordinary people and objects than of archetypal forms and images. The child lives, as it were, in a fairy tale world. This becomes understandable when one considers that the archetype is defined as an inborn pattern or form of perception and behavior. It may therefore be assumed that formative principles exist within the psyche, serving as models for proper understanding of, and behavior in, the outer world. Any situation can activate such a pattern, meaning that it is immediately and automatically grasped and interpreted in accordance with it. The innate pattern associates with and assimilates the present situation, so that the inner image appears outwardly in the given object. The next step in the process of becoming conscious consists in learning to distinguish between the outer, so-called real world, with its actual people and tangible objects, and the primordial archetypal world into which human beings are, in a sense, born. The archetypal world exerts an uncanny fascination and has a numinous effect. It is a realm filled with wonders. It not only harbors terrible mothers and other frightening figures, but is also, like the Celtic land of the living or paradise, a place of bliss. The necessity of relinquishing this wondrous world often arouses the strongest resistance, for what is gained in exchange is usually far less alluring. The enchantment of this realm is one reason why childhood is so deeply cherished and longed for, and why the step into life and reality proves so difficult. For the same reason, many myths recount the origin of humanity in paradise or speak of a golden age that was lost and replaced by a world of far lesser perfection. The yearning for the mother can therefore also be understood, in non-mythological terms, as the attraction exerted by the unconscious, a constant influence comparable to the effect of the law of gravity. For this reason, the development and maintenance of ego consciousness is so often represented in hero myths, since it constitutes an achievement that can be likened to a struggle with an overpowering monster and demands almost superhuman strength. Consciousness itself is an accomplishment that requires energy. It can sustain itself only for limited periods, after which a return to unconsciousness, sleep, becomes necessary in order to restore the energy that has been expended. The emergence of consciousness thus appears almost miraculous or supernatural, while the falling back into the original state happens all too easily. In this sense, insofar as unconsciousness represents the primary condition and its overcoming demands great effort, nature or the unconscious may be compared to a mother who holds her children firmly in the initial state or seeks to draw them back into it. The temptation to sink back into unconsciousness is a widely known human experience, and has found especially vivid expression in folklore and fairy tales. The many legends of nymphs and water spirits who lure men into their element with irresistible song vividly portray the attraction that rises up from the depths, from the unconscious itself. The wish to hold the child fast and to possess it, which on the human and personal level appears as a drive for power, is in reality grounded in patterns inherited from Mother Nature and, ultimately, in the inertia of matter. Precisely because this tendency rests on such primitive and fundamental facts, the corresponding human attitude possesses the compelling power and effectiveness that characterize it. It represents natural, archetypal behavior, from which one can free oneself only through a higher level of consciousness that makes it possible to overcome mere nature. Thus, behind the personal mother there always stands the archetypal figure of the Great Mother, who permeates the individual human being unnoticed and endows the personal relationship with a far larger, archetypal image. This depiction, however, illustrates only one side of the mother-child problem. For just as nature seeks not only inertia, sleep, and death, but also life, growth, and fertility, so too this opposing tendency is present in both mother and child. A woman does not wish to bear children merely in order to devour them. She also desires that they should thrive, be happy, and achieve success. This tendency, when pursued in a one-sided way, nevertheless also conceals serious dangers. Maternal ambition may exert pressure on the child's development and lead it along paths that are not truly its own. The only attitude that can rightly be called maternal, in the sense of genuinely serving life, arises out of both the conflict and the cooperation between the opposing impulses to restrain and to encourage. Only under these conditions can the child truly leave the mother's orbit and the paradise of childhood. Ordinarily, The child also experiences an urge to go out into the world, which appears attractive, interesting, and rich in possibilities. One important reason for this lies in the fact that the archetypal images of the inner world appear outwardly. In other words, they are projected onto the external world, which is then endowed with a heightened power of attraction. The drive toward life and action awakened in this way also fills the hero Perceval, drawing him away from his mother and setting him on the path toward the treasure hard to attain, the quest of the Grail. What most strongly attracts him is precisely that which his mother seeks to warn him against. Before following him further on his journey, another characteristic feature of the original situation must be considered: the fact that Perceval is without a father. The different accounts vary somewhat on this point. In one version, it is related that Perceval's father was wounded in both thighs during battle and left crippled. Through a series of misfortunes and social upheavals following the king's death, he lost his possessions and was forced to flee. He was carried in great haste, together with his family, on a litter to a forest that belonged to him, where there stood a house in which he could remain hidden. He later died of grief over the loss of 2 of his sons, who were killed in battle on the same day, when Perceval was still a small child. The similarity between the situation of Perceval's father and that of the wounded Grail King is striking. In other versions, the father is already dead at the time of Perceval's birth. Fatherlessness appears, to some extent, to be one of the characteristic attributes of the mythological hero, as can be observed in many myths and fairy tales. The same motif is encountered in the dreams and fantasies of modern people, and not least in actual life. So how might this be understood? It may be that in the case of a fatherless boy, all the conditions that predispose him to become a hero are strengthened and intensified, because he must find his own way and is compelled to develop independence and a sense of responsibility. By contrast, a boy who grows up under the guidance of a father who offers support may feel less driven toward such achievements. For the latter, the father represents the image of the successful man in the outer world, whereas for the fatherless boy this image falls back upon himself, as it were, and urges him toward its realization. On the other hand, the absence of the father, whether through death or through failure to fulfill his role as father and masculine example, may give rise in the son to the sense that all possibilities and realms of masculine achievement are open to him, since he can expect nothing from the father. The disadvantage, however, is that such a son runs the risk of overreaching himself in one direction or another. Another contributing factor appears to be connected with the mother. A woman without a husband will naturally tend to transfer onto her son what she might have expected from a partner, such as the wish that he should become a hero, in the hope that he will accomplish what the father failed to achieve. A further, curious circumstance also plays a role. In the dreams and fantasies of even happily married women, there often appears a mysteriously fascinating masculine figure, a demonic or divine dream or shadow lover, which Jung has called the animus. Not infrequently, the woman harbors a more or less conscious secret idea that one of her children, preferably the eldest or the youngest, was fathered by this psychic lover. Such a child is then easily endowed with superhuman qualities. The figure of this ghostly lover is not merely personal. Insofar as it appears transpersonal and demonic, it belongs to the realm of the archetype. In other words, the image of the hero does not arise solely from parental influence, but rests upon an inherent, primordial phenomenon. The hero figure is one of those timeless archetypal images that lie dormant in the depths of every soul and shape human life and destiny to an unsuspected degree. If fatherlessness is regarded as one of the characteristic features of the hero, it must be emphasized that he is often considered to descend from a superhuman or non-human father rather than from an ordinary human one. In the religions of many early peoples, an animal or a plant, or more rarely an object, is revered as the ancestor of a tribe and honored accordingly. Countless examples of this belief can be found in myth, folklore, and fairy tale. The stories of Greek mythology, in which a god unites with a human woman, often in animal form, such as Zeus appearing as a bull with Europa or as a swan with Leda, are widely known. From such unions arise demigods and heroes. It is equally well known that children often entertain the idea that they are not truly the offspring of their parents, but were exchanged or adopted, and that they are in reality princes or princesses. Such fantasies, even when they remain unconscious, can influence a child's behavior and may underlie a sense of estrangement from reality or a lack of adaptation. These imaginings may, of course, be dismissed as wish fulfillment fantasies, which they certainly are in part, yet they also possess a particular value. They can give courage to a young person who, when confronting the world, naturally feels small, weak, and helpless in the face of its power. In this way, they help to master fear and uncertainty. Properly understood, this means that in the figure of the hero an ideal is personified, an ideal that serves as a powerful stimulus and a valuable support throughout life. In this way, the archetype proves helpful by indicating a basic pattern for behavior in particular situations and by repeatedly reminding the individual of these patterns. It has been observed that archetypal dreams tend to arise in critical moments of life, at turning points that demand a new orientation or a fresh adaptation. When an archetype appears at such a moment, it can provide the encouragement and confidence needed to meet the challenge at hand. Herein lies the so-called therapeutic value of myths and fairy tales. They present an archetypal event, a fundamental pattern of human behavior, by which one may orient oneself or find a model to follow. The influence of archetypes, however, can also be negative. In some cases, they may lead to a complete denial of life or even to a psychotic state. For example, when an individual identifies with a hero image and misuses it solely for the glorification of the ego. This does not mean that the person consciously believes himself to be a hero, but rather that he behaves as one whenever the opportunity arises. On a level higher than the mythological or the childish, the same idea appears in the notion of the unknown Father as a spiritual or divine being or principle. This concept finds particularly clear expression in the figure of Christ, who is described as both the Son of God and of man. It is evident that this idea signifies far more than mere psychological support or an infantile fantasy. It gives form to the fundamental and indelible sense that there is something within human beings that transcends the merely human or animal, whether it be called an immortal soul, a divine spark, or by some other name. The narrative now returns to the story itself. As the young son of the widow rides through the forest one fine morning, he hears the clash of weapons and the pounding of horses' hooves, which he assumes come from devils. He feels no fear, however, and instead considers how he might best fight the strongest among them. When 5 knights in shining armor ride out of the forest before him, he is so overwhelmed by the splendid sight that he no longer takes them for devils but for angels. His mother has told him that angels are the most beautiful beings next to God, and so he asks one of the knights, who has questioned him, whether he is God. He then learns that these dazzling figures are called knights. Without paying attention to the knight's questions, he asks endlessly about their weapons and armor. The knight remarks to his companions that nothing is to be gained from this Welshman, who asks only about what lies before his eyes, what it is called, and what purpose it serves. At this point they shout to Perceval that the Welsh are by nature more foolish than grazing beasts, that this one too is like an animal, and that only a fool would waste time with him. That Perceval is explicitly described as Welsh has little to do with his actual nationality. Rather, it serves to characterize the hero as rough, uncultivated, and naive. The term Welshman was evidently used as a synonym for a primitive and unsophisticated, even somewhat inferior, man. In the description of Perceval's meeting with the knights, this rather coarse behavior is clearly displayed. At the same time, it becomes equally evident that it does not truly express his inner nature. When the knight replies that he received his armor from King Arthur, Perceval immediately resolves to seek out the king and ask for a similar suit for himself. He is firmly determined to become a knight. This realization and intention mark the first emergence of an awakening self-awareness, which, even though it initially takes the form of a childish wish, unmistakably reveals what will later prove to be his true goal and vocation. All at once, a path opens before him, which in a deeper sense is the path toward himself. From this course he allows neither his mother's suffering nor anything else to turn him aside. It often happens that such an intense experience in childhood or early youth becomes decisive for the whole of a person's later life. At such moments something appears outwardly, that is, in projection, which is inwardly real for the individual, so that it moves and stirs him to the depths of his being. It is frequently observed that the archetypal images of the inner world project themselves onto the outer world and become visible there. Insofar as they arouse interest and fascination, they make possible, or even compel, a turning toward the external world. This is one of the meaningful functions of projection. Its role is not only to keep painful insights at a distance by attributing them to others, but also to fulfill the opposite task of rendering things consciously perceptible and distinguishable, since they confront the ego with what is not the ego. For Perceval, the encounter with the knights has precisely this significance. It brings about his separation from his mother and his entry into the world. When he tells his mother of the meeting, she characteristically falls into a faint, and by this reaction she loses her power over the boy. After regaining consciousness, she tells him about his father, that he, like herself, was of noble descent, that he was wounded in both thighs in battle and left crippled, that he then unjustly lost his possessions and finally withdrew into exile in the forest. Knighthood, no less than the world itself, treated him harshly, for not only was he incurably wounded, but his two elder sons also became victims of their calling and died in battle. Their father succumbed to grief over their deaths, which gives ample reason for the mother's wish to keep herself and her only surviving son far removed from the world. Perceval, however, shows not the slightest interest in any of this. He simply remarks that he does not understand what she is telling him and asks instead for something to eat. He declares that he wishes to go to the king who makes knights, and that go he will, whatever the cost. Here one sees with what firmness the boy asserts himself. For him, the mother signifies little more than the source of food. What she says or feels carries no weight when set against the urgency of his wish to become a knight. When she realizes that her misgivings have no effect on him, she submits to what cannot be prevented. She equips him with riding clothes and makes him a garment in the Welsh manner, an intentionally crude and awkward outfit, so that at court he will appear as a clumsy and foolish rustic. After giving him all manner of advice and admonitions, Perceval takes his leave and sets out on his journey. When he has gone some distance, he looks back once and sees his mother lying on the bridge as though lifeless. Yet he spurs his horse onward and continues without a moment's hesitation. Nothing interrupts the force of his instinct-driven departure, which shows that the vision he has seen, the knights, possesses a power before which everything else fades away. After leaving home, Perceval undeniably behaves in a reckless and uncouth manner. On the following day, he comes upon a splendid tent, which he mistakes for a church. Inside, he finds a young woman asleep, surprises her, kisses her against her will, and takes her ring, explaining that his mother instructed him to do so. Guided by the directions of a charcoal burner, he then makes his way to Cardoul, the residence of King Arthur. As he approaches the castle, a knight clad in red, holding a golden goblet in his right hand, rides out through the gates. This knight has stolen the cup from Arthur's table and commands Perceval to carry his challenge to the king, declaring that he contests Arthur's right to his lands. Perceval rides into the castle and straight into the great hall, where King Arthur sits at a table, so lost in thought that he fails to notice the newcomer. Perceval turns away, intending to leave, but as he does so his horse bumps against the king, startling him from his brooding. Arthur apologizes for not returning the greeting and explains that his distraction is due to his anger over a grave insult. His enemy, the Red Knight, has brazenly robbed him of the golden goblet and, in the act, has spilled its contents over the queen, who in her indignation has withdrawn to her chambers. Perceval asks the king to knight him at once, for he wishes to set out immediately to win the Red Knight's armor, which has captured his imagination. Ku, the seneschal of the court, always quick to mock, urges him to go ahead and take it. Perceval needs no second encouragement. He returns straightway to the Red Knight and bluntly demands that he surrender his armor and weapons. The knight, taking him for an impudent youth, strikes him with the shaft of his lance. Perceval answers by throwing his spear, which pierces the knight through the eye and kills him on the spot. With the help of one of Arthur's squires, Perceval removes the armor from the dead man and puts it on over his Welsh clothing, which he refuses to discard. He takes the knight's weapons and horse for himself, gives his old mount to the squire, and hands over the stolen goblet so that it may be returned to the king. This first appearance of Perceval at Arthur's court introduces, in a casual and almost unconscious way, a motif that will later become one of the central themes of the legend. He arrives to find the court in a state of disorder. The king has suffered an injustice, the queen has been insulted, and both are visibly disturbed as a result. Here appears the first sign of the troubled and unredeemed condition of the land of the Grail, reflected in the disrupted state of the king's court. It functions like a presentiment of what is to come, a kind of prefiguration, a mode of thought well known to the medieval mind. In many religious writings, for example, events of earlier sacred history were understood as anticipations of later fulfillment. In this connection, particular importance was given to the idea that, through successive stages, a deeper and clearer meaning gradually reveals itself. Such ideas also play a significant role in the Grail legends. They belong to those concepts deeply rooted in the soul, to those archetypal images that give direction and meaning to human life. What exists now is only a partial and incomplete expression of what is destined to appear more fully later. The present thus stands as a dim reflection of a future realization. The same pattern can be observed in ordinary life. Certain situations, with variations, tend to recur again and again. At first they may seem accidental or meaningless, much like Perceval's exploit. Yet if attention is drawn to the repetition of such events, and they are observed more carefully, it becomes apparent that they are usually modified expressions of a significant inner tendency characteristic of the individual. This repetition continues until the underlying meaning is understood and its purpose fulfilled. The deeds of the hero, which occupy such an important place in myths and fairy tales, are to be understood in this sense as well. Through constantly renewed effort, often under strain that exceeds ordinary human limits, and undeterred by failure or danger, the hero is driven to strive for the highest values. This inner necessity appears as both a foreboding and a task, one that is placed upon him from the very beginning of life. The story of Perceval offers a particularly clear illustration of this striving. As has been shown, becoming a knight initially meant little more to him than the satisfaction of desire. Only gradually, and through many errors, did he grow into what he was meant to become, the foremost knight, the one destined to win the Grail. In the literary works under consideration, the knight embodies the image of the higher human being as it was conceived in that era. Only chosen knights were admitted to Arthur's Round Table, and these were men who had mastered not only the outward knightly skills, such as the use of weapons, riding, and hunting, but who also possessed the inner virtues of knighthood. These included endurance, courage, fearlessness, love of battle, a thirst for adventure, and above all constancy and loyalty in the highest degree. Faithfulness to friends and vassals, and loyalty even toward one's enemy, were regarded as the supreme virtues, and anyone who violated them lost his knightly honor. Beyond engaging in tournaments and seeking adventure for the honor and glory of chivalry, the task of Arthur's knights was to establish order in the land, to prevent injustice and violence, and above all to protect women and maidens in distress. Across the centuries, these knights embodied an ideal that deeply stirred even Perceval. Thinking itself was not considered a knightly art. The only intellectual activity mentioned in the stories is the occasional game of chess. Thought was regarded as the domain of the clerics. Within Arthur's circle, however, this function was fulfilled by Merlin, who, because of his twofold descent, his father a devil and his mother a pure maiden, knew the secrets of both past and future, and thus possessed a mode of thought that looked both forward and backward. The figure of the king displays, even more than that of the knight, an overarching principle of conscious rule, as is clearly shown in fairy tales and dreams. Arthur, the Lord of the Round Table, therefore appears as the dominant collective image of Christian knighthood. In a certain sense, the king embodies the idea of the human totality made visible in a collective and conscious form. In this way, Arthur represents the concept of wholeness as it was understood in the early centuries of the Christian era. His round table and his circle of 12 knights clearly associate him with Christ. For Perceval, this king, his future lord, thus represents the ideal of wholeness that he is able to grasp and to serve. Alongside Arthur, another king, the wounded Grail king, will later assume a central role in Perceval's life. Perceval's father, who suffers in a manner similar to the Grail king, represents the personal and human authority of the father. King Arthur stands for a higher and more comprehensive authority, the ideal of totality within Christian chivalry, while the Grail king embodies this same idea in a form that is more fully developed. The psychological significance of the Red Knight is also worthy of consideration. In many respects, he resembles Perceval, for he too behaves awkwardly at the king's court. By stealing the goblet and spilling its contents over the queen, he violates the feminine principle, a transgression that Perceval will himself later commit in the course of the story. In this sense, the Red Knight may be understood as Perceval's double or shadow. Psychologically, the shadow refers to the inferior, darker, or less refined aspects of a person that coexist with the conscious ego, often unnoticed. These traits are frequently emotional in nature, possessing a degree of autonomy and sometimes overwhelming conscious control. The contents of the shadow are partly personal and could, with moral effort, be examined in the light of self-knowledge. They are not entirely evil, for they often indicate vitality and a closeness to instinct, which carries positive value. Yet the shadow is also linked to a collective darkness, which can crystallize into archetypal images of destructive forces and confront humanity with terrifying challenges. The Red Knight, therefore, ultimately leads Perceval into the threatening depths of the problem of evil. For the present, however, he can be understood as Perceval's personal shadow, the sum of emotion and barbaric thoughtlessness that must be confronted and integrated before Perceval can become a true Christian knight. In numerous northern folk tales, a character known as Ritter Rot performs the role of the envious and slanderous antagonist to the hero. In ancient Ireland, the otherworldly fairy realm occasionally sent out red warriors, the Siths, against the heroes of this world, and the Red Knight shares this otherworldly origin. He slanders the hero to the king, attempting to bring about his death, yet such actions typically advance the hero instead. In this way, the Red Knight embodies the role of a dangerous shadow element. In mythology, the color red often carries a dual significance. It is associated with blood, fire, love, and life, as well as with war and death. From this dual meaning, it becomes clear that the shadow figure is not solely destructive. Once integrated into consciousness, it can serve the interests of life. In the symbolic language of the alchemists, a red man appears as the personification of the first matter, or prima materia, of the philosopher's stone. He was to be treated with care, not fear, for despite his intimidating appearance, he is ultimately helpful. In this sense, the Red Knight represents the first manifestation of Perceval's future inner wholeness. Perceval, however, kills the Red Knight with a thoughtless brutality that does nothing to earn him praise. Yet the Red Knight had insulted Arthur and was merely receiving a return of his own actions. Psychologically, this killing of the Red Shadow Knight represents a violent repression of Perceval's own primitive emotions and impulses, serving as a first step toward the formation of a conscious personality. Every young person growing up within a social environment must pass through a phase of merciless subjugation of their inner, untamed emotionality before further development is possible. In Perceval's case, this occurs instinctively, driven by his desire to become a knight and gain admission to Arthur's court. After stripping the armor from his fallen enemy and putting it on himself, Perceval will also be referred to as the Red Knight. By overcoming the emotions that assailed him from within, the vitality and energy contained in those emotions are now available to the ego, which gains strength and significance. At the same time, it can be expected that Perceval will display a certain ruthless masculinity, which may lead him into further complications. A notable aspect of his youthful and naive behavior is that he did not fight the Red Knight to reclaim the cup for Arthur. He simply killed him because the red armor stirred his covetousness. The cup itself is merely incidental to him. He sends it back to Arthur via a squire, without going himself and without any awareness that the cup, the vessel that will later become the central motif, the Grail, is being hinted at for the first time. In legends and fairy tales, cups often carry fateful significance, either because of the drink they hold, as in the story of Tristan and Isolde, or because of their connection to the life of the owner or of one who has drunk from it. At this point, Perceval is clearly unaware of the cup's deeper meaning. Another important factor is the armor Perceval has taken from the slain knight. The manner in which it is seized is far from chivalrous, so a certain guilt is attached to the act. Notably, Perceval wears the armor over his coarse Welsh garment, refusing to part with it. On one level, this indicates that he perceives the armor as an extension of himself. On another, it shows that he is not yet a true knight but only displays a knightly exterior. This corresponds to the psychological concept known as the persona, or mask. The term mask signifies that the outward appearance does not reflect the essential nature of the individual, but rather the impression made on others. The persona acts as a kind of facade, generally designed to fit the society in which the individual lives, and is considered by analytical psychology to form a segment of the collective psyche. The individual, in this sense, appears primarily as a member of a race, clan, or professional class, rather than as a human being with unique personal characteristics. Such a persona develops almost automatically, as a person belongs to a particular family, nation, or class and shares its traits, values, and way of life. In early childhood, the psyche is one of participation or identity with the surroundings, and differentiation from the environment only arises with growing consciousness. At first, a child must simply accept the role assigned by family or society, as a son, daughter, young man, marriageable girl, parent, or representative of a profession. It is therefore telling that Perceval does not know his own name and identifies only with the words his mother uses to address him, such as Cher Fils, Beau Fils, or Beau Sire. At the same time, it is often observed that children in the first few years of life display distinct individuality and originality, which they may lose upon entering school or other social settings, where adaptation to collective patterns becomes necessary. While this may seem regrettable, such collective affiliation is essential. One cannot face the world as a child of nature or solely as the mother's little son. In this sense, the persona is not merely a mask or a superficial attempt to simulate something before the world. It is also a vital and necessary form of adaptation. Human society requires the observance of forms and norms, even in primitive social groups, as seen in totemistic customs, taboos, and marriage rituals. The development of social forms is a practical cultural necessity, though it comes at the cost of some of the natural, primitive attitudes exemplified by the Red Knight. This is why puberty initiations, which prepare a boy for full membership in the tribe, are often accompanied by severe and painful rites. The persona becomes a mere mask when it no longer serves its adaptive purpose, and instead conceals a void or falsifies the essential nature of the individual. Yet at the same time, it offers protection against the world and serves as a guide or model for what one hopes to achieve. When the ideal is poorly chosen, unattainable, or unsuited to the individual, striving toward it may lead to error. For the youthful Perceval, the ideal of knighthood is such a model. He does not yet embody it. He only possesses the armor, the outer appearance, into which he must grow. In that age, the knight represented a higher type of man, commanding universal respect. With the rise of the feudal system, knights became energetic representatives of worldly power, while clerics embodied spiritual values and cultivated spiritual authority, which inevitably also acquired worldly influence. Together, clerics and knights formed the two higher social ranks, standing above the burghers and peasants. The knight represents, at least as an idea, a higher, more refined form of the warrior, even if the individual knight might have been unrefined in reality. The ideal of chivalry in that age was expressed by poets through the figures of King Arthur and his knights of the Round Table. The term knight indicated a higher, nobler, and more disciplined human being. The virtues required, strength and skill in arms, valor, courage, and loyalty, particularly to the feudal lord but also to friends and even toward foes, were no small demands. At its deepest level, A religious idea lay behind this. Arthur's Round Table can therefore be seen as a symbol reflecting the developing consciousness of Christian man in the first millennium. The spread of Christianity at that time was closely linked to the civilizing mission of subduing the aboriginal brutality and unconsciousness of pagan peoples. This lent a higher purpose to the Christian knight's aggressive masculinity, placing it in service of a nobler ideal and a higher state of consciousness. Although Christianity had reached a high point in the 12th century, the conquest of pagan and barbarian elements was not yet entirely complete. Christianity was the prevailing religion, especially among those in power, but its acceptance did not always come from deep inner conviction as in earlier times when followers were persecuted. Often, when a king or powerful man converted, his followers and vassals did so automatically. Conversions frequently had practical rather than purely religious motives, such as the hope that the new god might be stronger or more helpful than the old gods in difficult circumstances. This was the case in the conversion of King Clovis in the late 5th century. According to contemporary accounts, some people were converted by divine summons, others by example or exhortation, and still others by evil influences or personal indiscretion. Many were drawn to religious orders by painful circumstances such as illness, poverty, captivity, shame, danger, fear of hell, or longing for heaven. It should also be noted that while the Anglo-Saxons had largely been Christianized by the 6th and 7th centuries, the Normans were not. Rollo, the first Duke of Normandy, was baptized in the early 10th century, yet even at his burial sacrifices were still made to the old gods. This was only about a century and a half before the Norman conquest of Britain, and roughly 2.5 centuries before the time of the story. Therefore, in the 12th and 13th centuries, the Anglo-Norman world remained closely connected to heathen traditions. A religion as spiritually refined as Christianity could not be immediately absorbed by the primitive mentality of the Western and Northern peoples of that era. Gregory the Great had already recognized this when he commissioned Augustine to convert the Anglo-Saxons. He advised Augustine to proceed gradually, to respect the old shrines rather than destroy them, so that the people would gather in familiar places, now to worship the true God. It was clear that one cannot sever all ties with a rough and uncultured spirit at once, just as a climber can reach a summit only step by step, not by leaps. From this perspective, the great spiritual task of realizing the Christian ideal remained entrusted to Christian chivalry. Perceval's journey leads him to a teacher, Gaunmont de Gort, who instructs him in the art of arms and the knightly virtues. Gaunmont tells him that he is now too old to remain under his mother's protection, and impresses upon him the importance of not asking too many questions, advice that will later prove crucial. Through this guidance, Perceval comes to understand that he has outgrown childish ways and must conduct himself accordingly. Following this instruction, Gaunmont confers the accolade, giving Perceval the highest order of knighthood, the order of chivalry which must be without stain, as ordained by God. Having achieved his first goal of becoming a knight, Perceval prepares to leave Gaunmont, who represents a father figure and would have gladly kept him. Perceval, however, chooses to continue on his journey into the world, intending to look after his mother, remembering that she had fallen on the bridge when he left. This subtle psychological detail is emphasized by Chretien de Troyes. Instead of returning home, Perceval arrives at the castle of Belrapire, where he encounters his first opportunity for chivalrous action. The chatelaine of the castle, the beautiful Blancheflor, is besieged by an unacceptable suitor who has nearly starved the fortress. At this stage of his journey, Perceval meets not the mother but the woman, embodied in the figure of the damsel in distress, an oppressed beauty needing deliverance, exceedingly attractive and almost irresistible to masculine sentiment. Naively, she comes to him at night to lament her troubles. Perceval's desire for battle is awakened, and he fights passionately on her behalf, successfully defeating the enemy and freeing the castle. Blancheflor rewards him with her love, marking the first conscious awareness of his manhood in a dual sense, to pledge himself to a woman and to protect her. This act was both a virtue required of Arthur's knights and a recommendation from his mother. This reflects a characteristic of that era, in which the service of women held a prominent role. Perceval's actions can be seen as a counterbalance to the excessive emphasis on the masculine. The menedienst, or homage of love, demonstrates that the principle of relatedness, of eros, was becoming more prominent and demanded greater attention. The literature of the time vividly illustrates the importance of this homage, seen not only in the songs of the troubadours and other poems, but especially in the Romans de la Table Ronde. At first, it may have been a question of giving proper consideration to the real woman, establishing a relationship with her that transcended mere sensual desire. Alongside this, however, was a respect for the feminine in general, and for the man's own inner femininity, the anima. The anima is understood as a personification of the unconscious within the man, appearing as a woman or goddess in dreams, visions, and creative fantasies. She represents his lady soul, as described by Carl Spitteler. This figure appears to derive from the mother imago, encompassing both the man's inherent femininity and his real experiences with women. At the same time, the anima precedes all personal experience with women. As a goddess, she is an archetype with a real, though invisible, existence that transcends actual encounters. When the anima remains within the soul rather than being projected onto a real woman, she serves as a mediator of the unconscious. The Grail bearer, whom Perceval encounters later, can be seen as such a figure. More broadly, many feminine characters in Grail literature bear the imprint of the anima, and should be understood less as real women than as anima figures endowed with superhuman qualities and archetypal traits. In contrast, the figure of Blancheflor emphasizes the real woman rather than the anima, which is still largely projected at this stage. It aligns with Perceval's development that, having left his mother and been made a knight, he should now encounter the objective woman, whose presence is still closely entwined with the anima. Although Blancheflor offers him a privileged position at Bel Rapier, Perceval is too committed to his own development to be satisfied solely with her love or the comfortable, respected life of a castle lord. After a brief stay at Bel Rapier, he continues his journey in search of new adventures. In those days, it was considered effeminate and unworthy of a true knight to linger excessively in homage to women. Such indulgence was referred to as axidy by many contemporary poets, including Chretien in Eric and Enid and the Knight of the Lion. For this reason, Perceval does not remain at Bel Rapier. In this instance, his urge to move onward is partly motivated by a desire to seek out his mother and bring her to Blancheflor, yet the roots of his yearning run even deeper. Riding without a fixed path, he comes upon a deep river. He assumes that his mother's house must lie somewhere on the far bank, yet no crossing is visible, and the road he follows appears to end. As if answering a silent prayer for guidance, he encounters a fisherman who shows him the way to the Grail Castle. While he does not find his mother there, he enters another world that corresponds to her, a land that, in Wolfram's words, can only be come upon unawares, a realm of dreams and visions, the unconscious. The approach to this otherworldly domain is marked by a sudden change in atmosphere, now magical in contrast to the previous events. This otherworld plays a central role in the Breton conte and the Celtic fantasy tradition. Significantly, the Gauls or Celts, as Caesar reported, regarded Dis Pater, the god of the underworld, as their forefather. Dis Pater may originally have been an earth deity who supplanted an older mother goddess. Irish and Welsh accounts similarly describe this other world as sometimes lying beneath the earth. It was believed that the mythical inhabitants of Ireland, the Tuatha de Danann, the people of the goddess Danu, had withdrawn into the hills, meaning the burial mounds, where they lived in perpetual youth and beauty in magnificent palaces called Sid. Other Irish names for the other world include Mag Mor, the Great Plain, and Mag Mell, the Pleasant Plain, also known as the Land of Youth, the Land of the Living, or under Christian influence, the Land of Promise. This realm was also often imagined as lying beneath water, called the Land Beneath the Waves, or as the Green Isle in the west, or the Land Beyond the Sea. It was sometimes referred to as the Island of Women, either exclusively inhabited by women or, as commonly believed, concealed within the everyday world behind a magic haze, visible only under special conditions to certain people. Such a situation arises in Perceval's story. When he arrives at the point where the road ends, he encounters a fisherman who directs him to the castle. The castle suddenly appears before him, dispelling his thought that the fisherman had played a trick. The gate is open, as if he were expected, and the Fisher King, now the suffering lord of the castle, is seated in the great hall awaiting his arrival. Everything has a dreamlike quality, as will the events that follow. Perceval has unexpectedly arrived, as if in a dream, at this central archetypal place, explaining the numinous atmosphere surrounding the Grail Castle. The peculiar, otherworldly quality of the Grail precincts has led some to view the castle domain as referring to the underworld. Some scholars, for instance, connect it with the legend of a submerged Breton town, visible only from time to time. Others hold similar opinions. Yet it appears more fitting to interpret the Grail Castle as the realm of the unconscious, which can be regarded as a kind of underworld in the sense that it houses immortal images. Returning to the unconscious and attending to its contents is often depicted in dreams and fantasies as a descent into the underworld, a motif that frequently recurs as one of the hero's typical deeds or tasks. But because the unconscious also contains life and the future, that is, growth and development within itself, it is more than merely the realm of the dead or an accumulation of the departed. The Grail Castle, therefore, is aptly compared to the unconscious, for anyone who enters it may also return, unlike the situation in the underworld. After greeting the newcomer and excusing himself for not rising due to infirmity, the lord of the castle, grey-haired and clad in costly robes with a sable cap, bids Perceval to sit near him and inquires about his origin. Upon learning that the youth left Belrapire that very morning, he can hardly believe that such a great distance could have been covered in a single day. The peculiarity of this distance is captured in Wagner's Parsifal, where on the way to the Grail Castle, Parsifal says, "I scarcely move, yet swiftly seem to run," and his companion replies, "My son, thou sayest here space and time are one." It is, therefore, a timeless dimension, akin to those often experienced in dreams. Given the extraordinary nature of the events that now befall Perceval, it is reasonable to treat the entire episode as a dream or a descent into the collective unconscious. It is well recognized that big dreams, which strongly influence the later life of a young person, often occur at puberty, making this interpretation of Perceval's experience fitting. After conversing for some time, a page enters carrying a sword, which he presents to the rich man, as the lord of the castle is called here, saying, "The blonde damsel, a niece, sends thee this. Thou mayest bestow it on whom thou wilt. Only 3 such swords exist, and the smith who forged them will die, leaving no others to be made. The damsel hopes that the recipient will appreciate the sword properly. Inscribed on the blade is the claim that it is made of true steel, breaking only under perilous circumstances known solely to its maker. The host presents the sword to Perceval, noting that it is a rare and precious weapon, destined in particular for him. In Wolfram's version, the sword is absent. Instead, the king's niece lends her cloak to Perceval. In most other versions, the sword is broken into pieces, and the knight destined to guard the Grail is expected to restore it to wholeness. After studying the sword for a while, Perceval sets it aside with his other weapons. What follows is the account of the true Grail vision, an event of such importance that it demands close attention. The chamber is lit by large candles resembling those found on altars. While the Fisher King speaks with Perceval, a page enters from an adjoining room carrying a white lance and walks between the fire and the 2 men on the couch. From the iron of the lance, a drop of blood falls to its tip and runs down to the page's hand. Perceval notices this, yet recalling his teacher's warning not to ask too many questions, he refrains from speaking. Soon 2 more pages enter, bearing many-branched golden candelabra with lit candles. Between them walks a maiden, gracefully adorned, holding a grail of pure gold, set with precious stones, radiating a light so brilliant that it overshadows the glow of the candles. Another damsel follows, carrying a silver-carved platter. Like the page with the lance, both maidens pass by the couch as they move from one room to another. Still, Perceval does not speak. The host then commands that washing water be brought and the table prepared for the meal. A broad ivory table, supported on ebony stands, is set before the couch and covered with a snow-white cloth. The first course is served, hind with pepper sauce, accompanied by delicious wine poured into golden goblets. During the meal, the Grail passes before them again, and Perceval observes that with each dish it circulates fully uncovered. Though he marvels at the sight, he cannot summon the courage to ask its meaning, deciding instead to inquire of a servant the next morning. After the meal, the lord of the castle continues his conversation with Perceval for a while, then refreshments such as fruit and evening drinks are served. The host bids Perceval good night and is carried out by 4 attendants. Perceval retires to the bed prepared for him in the great hall and sleeps until morning. Upon waking, he finds his armor and weapons ready beside him, but no one is there to help him don them, so he arms himself alone. All doors leading to the hall, except the one through which he entered, are closed, and no one responds to his knocking or calling. In the courtyard, his horse is saddled and waiting, the gate open, and the drawbridge lowered. As Perceval prepares to depart, the bridge is raised while he is still on it, forcing his horse to leap across. He turns and calls to anyone who might have raised the bridge, wishing to ask a question, but receives no reply. Left with no alternative, he continues on his way. In Wolfram, the episode of the Grail Castle follows a similar course to that in Chretien, though with some notable variations, which warrant a detailed account. Perceval departs from Belrapire and his wife Conduiramas to venture into the world and gain greater renown as a knight. Unlike Perceval, the psychologically significant motivation of seeking his mother is absent. Instead of encountering a river, Perceval arrives at a lake, where he meets a fisherman who directs him to the castle. The events at the Grail Castle, particularly the Grail procession, are described with far greater elaboration and magnificence in Wolfram. Several elements absent from Chretien's version suggest the influence of another source. For instance, upon seeing the bleeding lance, those present break into loud lamentations. In Chretien, the company is not specifically described, though it is mentioned that about 500 knights could have taken their places around the enormous hearth. Wolfram, by contrast, gives detailed arrangements, 100 tables and the seating of 400 knights who partake of the banquet. The Grail-bearer, Repance de Scoy, is attended by a retinue of 24 damsels in multicolored robes, some carrying candelabra, others bearing a precious tabletop of garnet hyacinth with its ivory legs, and 2 silver knives, whose purpose will become clear later. The Grail itself is brought in on a deep green silk cloth called Ochmardi, and is depicted not as a vessel but as a stone. The solemn, richly colored procession evokes the mystery festivals of antiquity, in which sacred objects were carried ceremoniously. In the last book of the Golden Ass, Apuleius presents a similar procession in honor of Isis. Scholars have suggested that such ancient rites may have provided a model for the Grail procession in Chretien. Apuleius describes how the hero, as Mystagogue, wears a cloak adorned with griffins and dragons to signify his association with the sun god, marking his consecration into Isis's service. In Wolfram, the Grail-bearer reminds Perceval of the cloak she had given him upon his arrival at the castle. The sumptuous meal, served on precious dishes, is described in careful detail, and it is emphasized that each guest receives the food he desires, all through the power of the Grail. When the meal has been cleared and the procession of maidens has returned to the chamber from which it came, Perceval glimpses through the open door an old man of extraordinary beauty, with hair as white as snow. This is the same king to whom, in Chretien, the host is brought in the Grail. Observing all these marvels, Perceval, taking his teacher's admonition all too literally, refrains from asking the pressing questions that arise in his mind. His host bids him good night, and he is led to a chamber where a luxurious bed has been prepared. Young pages undress him, and 4 damsels bring mulberry juice, wine, claret, and fruits of a kind that seem to grow in paradise, laid upon a white cloth. After the damsels retire, Perceval lies down, but his sleep is disturbed, plagued by bad dreams, as his mother had once been. Upon waking, he finds the castle empty and silent. He departs without encountering anyone who might have explained the strange events he has witnessed. Perceval has seen the mysterious castle, the ailing king, the bleeding lance, and the Grail, yet because he did not inquire into their meaning, they vanish from him without revealing their significance. The entire episode thus resembles a dream, an initiation dream of sorts. When he wishes to return to his mother, he instead arrives at a castle that is difficult to find. It belongs to the unconscious, the realm of the mothers. While not explicitly described this way here, in later contexts this fantastical castle, the Chastel Merveilleuse or Castle of Marvels, also called the Château aux Pucelles, is freed from enchantment by Parsifal's double, Gauvain. Within it dwell real mothers, including Arthur's aged mother and Gauvain's mother, along with many other women and girls. This echoes the Celtic otherworld, often called the Island of Women, suggesting that such magical castles represent the unconscious. Yet in the Grail Castle, Parsifal does not encounter a world of mothers. Instead, he meets fathers of a sort, though they belong to the distaff side. The rich fisher, master of the Grail Castle, is described in Chretien as Parsifal's cousin, while the mysterious old king to whom the host is brought is his uncle, a brother of his mother, reflecting the concept of a spiritual father often found in primitive societies. According to Wolfram and Forters, the Grail King is a brother of Parsifal's mother, and Repance de Scoy is his aunt. Before his departure, Parsifal's mother had told him of his father, brothers, and their fates, but he had shown no interest, focused solely on his own ventures. Nevertheless, her story seems to have left an impression on his unconscious, arousing the images of paternal figures that he then encounters in the Grail Castle. Such reactions are commonly observed in real life. An experience disregarded by the conscious mind can activate unconscious contents, which then manifest in dreams. This exemplifies the subtle psychological depth in Chretien's work, remarkable for its insight into the workings of the human psyche. It is also noteworthy that in Wolfram, the guardian of the Grail is portrayed as Perceval's mother's brother, or alternatively as his grandfather or forebear on the maternal side. This may be connected with the emphasis placed on the feminine element in that era, expressed through the service of women. Matrilineal features, possibly reflecting an older social order and influenced by Celtic traditions, appear throughout this literature. More likely, however, this emphasis reflects the predominance of the unconscious, which in men is often characterized by feminine elements. Whether these figures are maternal or paternal forebears, with the exception of the Grail-bearer, who can be understood as an anima figure, the hero encounters father figures in the Grail Castle. Ancestors, or their spirits, also play a central role in the initiation dreams and ceremonies of so-called primitive peoples. Establishing a relationship with one's ancestors is a fundamental aspect of initiation rites, enabling the youth to become a fully integrated member of the tribe. In a similar fashion, Perceval undergoes initiation in the Grail Castle. Though he had already been inducted into a brotherhood through the accolade given by his teacher, Gaunment, he now becomes acquainted with his spiritual forebears. For him, the fatherless son of the widow, this is doubly significant, as the connection with male relatives allows him, in a sense, to acquire a father. This emphasis on the masculine element enables the youth to become a true man for the first time. The importance of this kinship motif is underscored by its presence in all versions of the story. In some, it is explicitly stated that one who wins the Grail must not only prove to be the greatest hero, but must also be a descendant or relative of the Grail King. In primitive initiation rites, the novice is instructed and initiated into the tribe's mysteries by the ancestors or ancestral spirits. Likewise, the treasures guarded by the Grail King are revealed to Perceval as if they were sacred relics of the tribe. Before examining these treasures more closely, it is essential to consider the type of family into which Perceval is being admitted. In this context, the masculine element does not refer to the physical father or ordinary masculinity, but rather to the masculine spirit connected with the world of the father, which should be understood as a higher state of consciousness. This element has been absent in the young Perceval, who has been guided solely by his instincts. His mother had already told him that she came from a very noble family, and from the hermit Trevisan he later learns that she is the sister of the hermit and of the old Grail King. The emphasis on a matrilineal and especially spiritual lineage suggests that the relationship in question is not physical or worldly, but psychic and spiritual. Perceval's maternal uncles are both described as highly unworldly. The hermit survives on bread and grapes brought daily by an angel, while the old Grail king, father of the rich fisher, is so spiritual that nothing is required for his life except the host brought in the Grail. If Perceval belongs to this family, it pertains more particularly to the spiritual Perceval, the higher man within. In versions connecting the Grail with Joseph of Arimathea, the Grail king's descent is traced from Joseph or Nicodemus, and the one who wins the Grail must prove descent from this line. This links the hero to Christ, supporting the view that the Grail hero represents the higher man in a religious sense. Here, two aspects are introduced. 1. The events can be seen as symbolic depictions of the archetypal development of the hero, and 2. They possess a deeper dimension that directly engages the issues of the Christian era. Within this context, Perceval's figure is framed by the psychological development of the Christian age, suggesting that he is destined for a specific, savior-like role. As Christ was prefigured by a long line of ancestors, divided into 3 groups of 14, Perceval is also related back to the lifetime of Christ, hinting that he is positioned as a parallel to Christ. His role as a Christ-like Redeemer figure will become even clearer later in the narrative. Attention now turns to the Grail procession, in which feminine figures are present. One of these, the Grail-bearer, a niece or daughter of the Grail king. In Chretien she is the sister of the rich fisher and Perceval's aunt, is particularly vividly portrayed. She may be understood as an anima figure, a personification of inner psychic realities, since she belongs to the dream world in which these events unfold. One of the anima's functions is to reveal the images of the unconscious, as Perceval experiences here. This role is associated with the anima because perceiving inner images requires a feminine receptivity, whereas understanding and interpreting what has been seen is made possible by the masculine mind. Additionally, a man's individual anima, his own feminine aspect, is largely unconscious to him. Consequently, functions corresponding to this aspect often take the lead within the unconscious. A more detailed discussion of this anima figure will follow, as she appears to stand in a compensatory relationship to Blancheflor. The functions of both feminine figures illustrate this dynamic. Before exploring this further, attention should be given to the objects Perceval is allowed to see in addition to the guardian of the Grail and the archetypal anima figure. These include the sword, the lance, the Grail, the table, the carving platter, and, in Wolfram, 2 knives. These objects symbolically represent some of the essential meaning of the Grail legend. The first object shown to Perceval in the Grail procession is the sword, a weapon that will never break except under perilous circumstances known only to the smith who forged it. Perceval merely gazes at it and sets it aside. As a masculine instrument, the sword symbolizes strength, power, and, in that age, particularly chivalry. It is a tool meant to overcome hostile forces. As the weapon most characteristic of heroes or knights, the sword is often intimately connected with its owner, almost as if it were part of him, and at times it possesses a name and a personality of its own. Arthur's sword is called Excalibur or Galiburnus, while Roland's is named Durandal. When Arthur departs by boat to Avalon, an arm rises from the water and takes Excalibur down into the depths. The sword thus serves as a symbol or representative of its owner, and because the knight's task is to engage with and master the outer world, the sword can be seen as analogous to certain functions of the ego, to which this task belongs. It may appear paradoxical that Perceval discovers the fatherly, masculine impulse to become conscious within the motherly realm of the unconscious, of which the Grail Castle forms a part. This idea is further reinforced by the fact that it is the feminine Grail-bearer who presents him with the sword. This demonstrates how the weapons necessary for mastery of life and the world are often provided by the anima, emerging from the maternal matrix of the unconscious. The development of a conscious ego as the center of awareness begins in childhood and initiates the process of individuation. Through this development, the original state of undifferentiation and identity with the surroundings gradually dissolves. It is crucial for any individual navigating life to possess an ego capable of understanding and confronting the world directly. This is equally vital for the process of individuation which typically intensifies in the second half of life. Without a defined ego able to face the inner world of the unconscious, there is a risk of being overwhelmed by unconscious contents. This point has been repeatedly emphasized in analytical psychology. Perceval's encounter with the Grail is intimately linked to the growth of his consciousness, and the sword he receives symbolically represents this progress. Beyond this, the sword carries additional meanings relevant to the concerns of the age. As a cutting instrument, it embodies separation or differentiation, and metaphorically it stands for the mind, particularly intelligence and understanding, highlighting the incisive quality of thought. As the sword of justice, it also signifies judgment, wrath, and vengeance. Discrimination, understood as judgment exercised with thought, is precisely what Perceval has thus far lacked. He has followed his mother's advice in a naively literal way, without reflection or exercise of personal judgment. This deficiency is evident when he intrudes upon the young woman in the tent and when he visits the Grail Castle. The unconscious seeks to remedy this lack, a demonstration of its compensatory function, by presenting him with the sword. At the same time, it draws attention to the sword's exceptional quality, while also signaling that there will be situations in which it is unreliable. This serves as a warning against wielding it blindly, an approach that would have aligned perfectly with Perceval's natural impulses. In many versions, such as those of Robert de Boron and Chrétien's Continuatus, the sword is already broken when it is presented to Perceval. This is usually explained as a consequence of its owner having made an unworthy or treacherous use of it. One of the essential requirements for the knight destined to win the Grail is the ability to restore the sword, thus demonstrating that he is the rightful, that is, the foremost and predestined hero. This motif is also significant in the quest, where the knight who finds the Grail, Galahad in that instance, must prove his descent from King Solomon. Only such a descendant is permitted to claim possession of this precious sword, carried on a mysterious or mystical ship sent to Britain for that purpose. The sword, therefore, appears to trace back at least to the early Christian era, and perhaps even further. It may be understood as symbolizing an attitude of righteousness, masculine judgment, and understanding, extending back to the Old Testament. This archaic form of rational judgment, no longer adequate to its present context, had to be surrendered, which is why the sword was shattered. Only after Perceval has come to realize, through direct contemplation, the unconscious contents symbolized by the Grail, can he restore the sword to wholeness. Only then can a new and non-destructive use be found for the discerning intellectual mind. In certain manuscript versions, it is noted that the sword is broken later in Perceval's hand, specifically when he fights Lorgelius de Lalande, the friend of the young woman in the tent. He discards the broken pieces and completes the struggle victoriously with the sword taken from the Red Knight. The figure of Lorgelius, as his name suggests, represents a shadow aspect, not, like the Red Knight, a symbol of effect and brutality, but of the pride of chivalry. Psychologically, it is natural that a young person striving toward a lofty ideal, such as chivalry, may unknowingly succumb to arrogance. Lorgelius is further depicted as a knight who wrongly believes his innocent lady guilty of unfaithfulness and punishes her cruelly. This rigid demand for absolute fidelity is extreme and inhuman. This shadow of arrogance is more subtle and harder to detect than the overt aggression of the Red Knight, because it is a secret, inflated vanity masquerading as the principle of knightly honor. Confronted with this problem, the power of judgment or thinking, symbolized by the sword from the Grail Castle, predictably fails. The historical and symbolic significance of this failure, particularly in relation to mental attitude and judgment, will be considered further in connection with the lance. Like the sword, the lance or spear is also a masculine symbol. Its primary quality, however, is not sharpness or separation, but aim, direction, and impact. This is particularly evident in the javelin, the weapon used by the young Perceval, and also in the arrow. Metaphorically, this characteristic can be understood as the perception of a goal or awareness of one's intention, as well as the ability to keep sight of and reach toward further possibilities. Psychologically, this corresponds to the function of intuition. Even though it is premature to speak of differentiated psychic functions at this early, youthful, or primitive stage, tendencies toward such development are already observable. Perceval hardly thinks or discriminates in a conscious sense, yet a strong drive toward his aims is evident, such as his determination to become a knight and his relentless search for the Grail. In this focus on distant goals, one may detect an early form of intuition, barely distinguishable from instinct. There are also hints of feeling judgment, as seen in the pleasure Perceval experiences when he first encounters the knights or meets Blancheflor, though these responses remain undifferentiated. In a mind not yet fully conscious, the psychic functions are intermingled. Only with growing consciousness do they become distinct and differentiated. The significance of the lance can also be understood in a broader, universal sense. The spear is frequently associated with particular gods. For instance, Wotan and Zeus each possess a spear, Zeus being identified with lightning or the thunderbolt. Apollo's arrows are similarly comparable to Wotan's spear. In Celtic mythology, often regarded as the source of the Grail Legend, both the sword and the spear or lance hold important roles. The semi-divine, mythical inhabitants of Ireland, said to have descended from heaven or from 4 cities where they mastered learning and the arts, brought with them a magical treasure from each location. The first was the Liar Fail, or Stone of Destiny, upon which Irish kings stood during their coronation. It was said to affirm the legitimacy of the king by roaring. This stone was brought to Scotland in the 6th century, and later taken to England by Edward I in the late 13th century, where it became the coronation stone in the coronation chair. To this day, British monarchs are crowned upon it. The second treasure was the unconquerable sword of the god Lug, the third a magic spear, and the fourth, the cauldron of Dagda, a vessel from which an entire army could be fed. These 4 treasures were naturally associated with the corresponding objects in the Grail legend, and are considered evidence of its Celtic or Irish origin. Fourfoldness is among the most universal of symbols, for the quaternity often represents the growth of consciousness. The idea of the world as a quaternity, perhaps originating in the 4 points of the compass which held great significance for primitive peoples, proved especially apt as a symbolic means of expressing consciousness, culture, and a conception of the world. The number 4 also relates to the process of individuation. This can be understood primarily as the natural process of the genesis and differentiation of an individual organism. The fact that no 2 plants or animals, and especially no 2 humans, are exactly alike, demonstrates the unique quality of each individual, who, while sharing general characteristics with others of the species, is distinguished by the particular combination of these traits. Psychologically, individuation signifies a process by which the individual differentiates from the collective psyche and develops into a unique personality. Individuality exists a priori as a latent pattern or predisposition determined by genetic makeup, but its realization requires engagement with the environment, which the individual may often find challenging. Adaptation is essential, since humans are not merely solitary beings but collective creatures inherently attuned to relationships with others. Thus, true individuality arises from the union of these opposing tendencies. The tension between them and their reconciliation demand the development of consciousness. Psychological individuation is therefore a process of becoming conscious, evolving through the individual's encounters with the outer world and with the inner objective world, the unconscious. In practice, individuation begins at birth with physical separation from the mother. Conscious development continues through engagement with the external world, a task typically occupying the first half of life. The second half is concerned with realizing the inherent individuality, as described earlier. This provides insight into why Perceval fails on his first attempt to claim the treasure hard to attain, the symbol of individuation, and why he must resolve other challenges before he can return to the quaternity of objects and grasp their deeper mystery. The lance holds a significant place in Celtic mythology and legend, as it does in the traditions of many other cultures. It often possesses magical qualities, as illustrated by the lance of the god Lug, which is likened to lightning. Numerous lances are said to have extraordinary powers. Some have a life of their own, requiring special handling to avoid harming their bearer, while others return to their owners when thrown. Bloody or flaming lances, reminiscent of the bleeding lance in the Grail procession, are frequent motifs. In Britain, the lance symbolized the hope of reclaiming the native land for exiled Britons. Historical accounts, such as Giraldus Cambrensis' journey through Wales, describe North Welsh Britons as distinguished by particularly long lances, giving rise to the name Peredur of the Long Lance for the Welsh Perceval. In the Grail Legend, the lance appears in various forms. In Chretien's work, it is introduced as the bleeding lance, though its origin is not specified. The Grail King is wounded by a lance wielded by a heathen adversary, and this act is said to have caused the curse afflicting the land of Logres. In the continuations of Chretien's poems, a grievous blow plays the same role. The lance, however, is not merely an instrument of injury. Like Arthur's sword Excalibur, it also has healing power. In Wolfram's Perceval, holding the bleeding lance to the wound is said to draw out poison and relieve the Grail King Anforta's suffering. In the quest, Galahad heals the king by spreading the lance's blood over the wound. The lance is usually carried by a page in Chretien and Wolfram, while in the continuation to Perceval, Gawain observes the bleeding lance standing in a holder, with blood flowing from the iron tip down the shaft into a silver vessel, and from there through a golden pipe into another silver vessel. With the Christianization of the legend, it was natural that the lance came to be identified with Longinus' lance. At the time when the Grail legend was developing, Longinus' lance was widely discussed, as it was said to have been discovered by the Crusaders at the siege of Antioch in the year 1098. This lance was credited with performing a miracle that contributed to the successful capture of the citadel. Albert of Aachen recounts the event. During the hardships of famine, siege, and attacks by the Turks, a cleric from Provence claimed in a vision to know the location of the lance that had pierced Christ's side. He informed the Lord Bishop Adhemer of Puy and Count Raymond of the place, the church of St. Peter, where they found the precious relic. The lance was shown to all the Christian princes, wrapped in fine purple cloth, inspiring great hope and joy, and venerated with solemnity and abundant offerings of gold and silver. A sacred lance, possibly the same as those previously mentioned, became known as the Mauritius lance because it was once held by the abbot of St. Maurice in the Valais. At one point, it was part of the German imperial regalia and was kept in the treasury of the Hofburg in Vienna until the year 1937. In the ritual of the Greek Church, a holy lance, in fact a lance-shaped knife, is used to cut the host on the paten, or to pierce the bread, symbolizing the slaying of the lamb. According to the liturgy of St. Chrysostom, it was carried in procession alongside the chalice and the paten. There is an interesting comparison between lance and sword in the Syrian Cave of Treasures, a collection of Christian legends from the 7th century. The text states that on Friday, the two-edged sword was given to the cherub, while Christ smote with a spear and broke the sword. This resembles the Fisher King's remark to Gawain that they had gained everything through the lance but lost it all through the sword, though in the legend the sequence is reversed. This comparison illuminates the symbolic meaning of both lance and sword. The sword signifies not only the discriminating, separating aspect of the intellect, but also the judging and wrathful intervention of God in earthly matters. In this regard, the alchemist Gerhard Dorn's statements, as cited in Psychology and Religion, are illuminating. After a long interval, Deus Optimus Maximus immersed himself in the innermost of his secrets and, out of compassion and the demands of justice, took the sword of wrath from the angel's hand. He hung the sword on the tree and substituted a golden trident, thereby transforming the wrath of God into love. When peace and justice were united, the water of grace flowed more abundantly, bathing the entire world. The sword is also interpreted as a symbol of divinity concealed within the human being, an inner psychic God image that transforms itself from within. This concept appears in the Gnostic texts of the Orphites and Simon Magus, where the sword first manifests as a spirit of life and nature hidden in man, gradually transmuting into a divine figure within the human being. In alchemical writings, the sword is likened to divine water or the stone. Mercurius, for example, functions as a permeating spirit, described as sharper than any two-edged sword. In essence, The sword signifies the life urge that leads to recognition of the self. According to the story, the sword is now broken due to treacherous misuse, signifying a false application of the intellectual faculties, which are therefore no longer able to function in the service of life. This mirrors the approach of the fathers of the Christian Church, who employed the sword of their intellect only within the limits of what was already accepted. Consequently, when confronted with certain paradoxes, such as the concept of the privation of good, they were unable to reach a direct understanding grounded in contemplation of both inner and outer reality. In this sense, the broken sword of the Grail story reflects the limitations of the thinking of that era, which could not adequately address the problem of the shadow and its paradoxes. For example, the paradox that great virtue can lead to pride and thereby be perverted into something evil. This is why Perceval's sword breaks during his fight with Lorgellius de la Lande. In these passages, the sharp, separating function of the sword is contrasted with the healing influence of the lance. Unlike the sword, the lance is aimed at a specific point, the essential center, directing its force precisely. It may be compared with the telum passionis of the alchemical Mercurius, the missile of passion sent forth by Mercurius. In both Chretien and Wolfram, the Fisher King is wounded by the poisoned lance of a heathen adversary. In the Lancelot Grail, the son of Joseph of Arimathea is struck in the thigh by a black angel and later healed by another angel with the same lance. He then prophesies that the lance is a sign of the beginning of the extraordinary adventure in Britain. At a future time, it will bleed again, and a later descendant of Joseph will be wounded in both thighs, recalling the wound by which, according to Chretien, Perceval's father was disabled. In many versions, the lance embodies both destructive and positive qualities within the same weapon, while also symbolizing the transmission of the Grail tradition to Britain. This connection is meaningful, as the Grail legend incorporated elements from Celtic and Germanic heathendom, which was more archaic and closer to nature than the Mediterranean cultures. The lance, being an older weapon than the sword, represents a more undifferentiated faculty of judgment, emphasizing directness and precision, hitting the target, rather than analytical discrimination. Occasionally, the lance is referred to as the Lance of Vengeance, as in the Merlin, while in the Spanish Demanda de San Graal it is called La Lanza Vengadora and is described as standing in a golden vessel or hovering in the air. It is similarly portrayed in the Lancelot Grail and the Quest. In Merlin, the king is again wounded by the lance, which is the source of the abnormal conditions affecting his land. In Perida, the lance signifies unavenged misdeeds. According to old popular beliefs, a crime contaminates the criminal, and if it remains undiscovered within the community, it contaminates society as a whole. Punishment serves as the eradication of this collective impurity. It appears, then, that the Grail King has been struck by an impulse rising unexpectedly from the unconscious, one with which he cannot come to terms. This impulse originates either from the heathen layer of the soul or from a dark adversary behind whom God himself seems to stand. The king's suffering will continue until this unconscious impulse is brought into consciousness. The close relationship between the lance and the Grail vessel is rooted in a medieval Christian understanding, clearly expressed in a creed from the 11th century. This creed, drawn up by Maurilius, Archbishop of Rouen, arose from the famous Last Supper dispute caused by the unorthodox views of Berenger of Tours. At the Synod of Rouen in the year 1055, the entire priesthood of Normandy was required to affirm the doctrine of the Eucharist, which the Church recognized as true. They believe with the heart and confess with the mouth that the bread placed on the altar is only bread before consecration, but through the consecration, by the ineffable power of the Godhead, the nature and substance of the bread is converted into the flesh of him who was conceived of the Holy Ghost, born of the Virgin Mary, who for humanity and salvation was scourged, crucified, laid in the tomb, and on the third day rose from the grave and sits at the right hand of the Father. Similarly, the wine, mingled with water and placed in the cup for consecration, is truly converted into the blood which, through the lance of the soldier, flowed from the wound in the Lord's side for the redemption of the world. According to this perspective, it is not so much the crucifixion of Christ that is regarded as the redeeming factor, but rather the blood that flowed from his side after his death. This reflects a fundamentally magico-archaic conception. From the earliest times, and continuing even today, blood has been considered a very special fluid, as evidenced by countless examples in religious and magical practices across all cultures. Blood is central to sacrifices in various systems of worship, to healing and maledictory magic, and to acts of consecration and initiation. Contracts are sealed and crimes expiated with blood, and even today, one may symbolically sell oneself to the devil using blood. This belief rests on the assumption that blood embodies the life principle and serves as the seat of the soul. This conception appears as far back as the Odyssey, where the souls of the dead regain consciousness by drinking sacrificial blood, and in the Old Testament, where it is written, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar, and for it is the life of all flesh, the blood of it is for the life thereof," as well as, "Only be sure that thou eat not the blood, for the blood is the life, and thou mayest not eat the life with the flesh." It is evident that blood is essentially a mana substance, and anything with great mana owes its effectiveness to an underlying archetypal idea. In this instance, it is the belief in the equation of blood with life and soul. The idea of blood as soul persisted into the Middle Ages, where the Eucharistic blood was understood to represent the soul of Christ, and for the same reason, the Grail vessel was thought to contain his soul. If such mysterious power is attributed even to ordinary human or animal blood, it follows that the blood of Christ carries an incomparably greater potency. In Christian doctrine, this blood is the means of salvation for all humanity. It is significant that the emphasis is not solely on the death of Christ, but on the blood shed in the process, for it is in the blood that the essential atoning power resides. In most versions of the legend, the bleeding lance is associated with the Grail because it is the instrument through which this redeeming blood is manifested. Drops of blood flowing from its tip, sometimes falling into the Grail vessel, symbolize the sacrificial death of Christ, perpetually occurring. Because of this belief, blood became the central sacrament and mystery of Christian ritual. Throughout history, but especially in the Middle Ages, this understanding of blood and its associated ideas profoundly moved people, inspiring both intellectual inquiry by the Church and devout participation by believers seeking to experience the meaning of Christ's suffering through self-abnegation and engagement with the sacred mystery. Many miracles were also reported in connection with the communion chalice or the Eucharistic bread, demonstrating how actively the imagination engaged with these sacred matters. This fascination with the mystery, so profoundly affecting to human beings, can also be seen as a form of the Church's response. Around the end of the 12th century, the ritual of elevation of the host was introduced, allowing the consecrated host to be shown to the congregation outside the communion service for the first time. At that time, people, who had previously been hesitant to witness the holy mystery, pressed forward eagerly to behold the elevated host. By the middle of the 13th century, this practice had become nearly universal, whereas earlier it had been expressly forbidden to look upon the sacred object. This desire to witness the unveiled mystery reflects the great spiritual awakening occurring in Western Europe at that time, a revival visible in every sphere of life. The intellectual advances of scholasticism, secular literature, artistic and architectural achievements, the founding of convents and monastic orders, the Crusades, chivalry, and the culture of courtly love all testify to this remarkable surge of spiritual energy, whose intensity and breadth were unparalleled. The Grail legends belong to this same springtime of the spirit, expressing the awakening of consciousness and devotion. The story of Perceval, in particular, reflects an effort to gain a clearer understanding of Christian doctrine, its rituals and sacred observances, which were devoutly practiced and deeply moving even when their full meaning was not comprehended. In this context, a reliquary containing the blood of Christ would possess immense numinosity, and the lance that brought forth the Redeemer's blood attained an almost divine significance. The motif of blood hidden in a vessel by Nicodemus also appears in the legend de l'Abbaye de Fécamp, where the vessel traveled by various means to Fécamp and became a renowned wonder-working relic. Fécamp was not the only site to boast a relic of Christ's blood. Equally famous was the Saint Sang of Bruges, brought from the Holy Land in the year 1149 by Count Dietrich of Flanders and presented to the city of Bruges, where the Chapel of the Holy Blood remains a notable site. Long before, A bowl containing Christ's blood was said to have been brought from Palestine to Europe by Charlemagne. A fragment of this bowl came into the possession of the monastery of Reichenau, detailed in the book De Translation Sanguinis. Many other monasteries and churches also took pride in possessing similar relics. The veneration of relics reached its height during the Middle Ages. Such devotion reflects the ancient, primitive need to connect divine power to a specific place or to a tangible, visible object, thereby making the location or object more concrete and enduring. Possessing wonder-working relics enhanced the reputation of a monastery or church, yet a stronger motive lay in the belief that every consecrated altar must contain relics. The special holiness attributed to relics of blood and the extraordinary power ascribed to them becomes understandable in light of this context. During the Middle Ages, blood played a significant role not only in church practices but also in the work of the alchemists. One author states that the soul dwells in the life spirit of the pure blood. Gerhard Dorn described the blood as an arcane, blessed substance of alchemical significance. Blood, as explained in alchemical studies, points to the animation of matter by an indwelling soul. Dorn notes that the alchemists spoke of their stone as possessing a soul because, in the final operations, by virtue of the power of this most noble fiery mystery, a dark red liquid, like blood, emerges drop by drop from their material and vessel. They prophesied that in the last days a most pure man would come to earth, sweating drops of rosy red blood, through whom the world would be redeemed from its fall. Similarly, the blood of their stone was believed to purify metals and heal human afflictions, thus animating matter and liberating life. Because Longinus' lance brings forth the redeeming blood of the Saviour, it holds immense significance. In the first continuation of the Perceval, the lance is described as overflowing with blood. It symbolizes humanity's capacity to perceive what is essential in the latent symbol of God, enabling this symbol to dispense its inexhaustible, life-giving spiritual power. As Christ ascended to heaven with his body, the only lasting evidence of his earthly life and the substance of his soul remained in this blood, preserved on the lance and in the Grail vessel. Consequently, the lance was regarded as humanity's arrow of love, aimed at the heart of Christ, and it was revered in this way throughout the Middle Ages. The Pandora, an alchemical text of 1588, includes an illustration in which a crowned figure, distinguished by her fishtail as a Melusine or mermaid, pierces Christ in his side with Longinus' lance. In front of her stands Eve, destined to be united with Christ as the second Adam. The Melusine represents the aqua permanens of alchemy, the eternal or enduring water. The text describes this water or elixir as a truth. In this depiction, the Melusine is a variant of the androgynous Mercurius, and her lance, like the flaming sword of the cherubim in Gerhard Dorn, is transformed into an instrument of love, aimed at Christ's heart or at the psychic element symbolizing the self. Psychologically, the term self denotes the totality of the human psyche, encompassing both conscious and unconscious elements, which transcends immediate awareness and underlies the process of individuation. This psychic totality is present from the very beginning as an entelechy of the individual, yet its various aspects gradually enter consciousness as the person matures, expanding the ever-changing horizon of awareness. Beyond this, there is often a numinous experience of inner psychic wholeness, accompanied by profound emotion, which the ego interprets as a manifestation of the divine. For this reason, experiences of God and experiences of the self are practically indistinguishable. The manifestations of the self, emerging from the unconscious, correspond with the God images of many religions and, when not personified, are represented by circular and square forms, frequently appearing in quaternary arrangements. These structures have been termed mandalas, drawing on an Eastern concept. Although Christ, the Son of Man, can be regarded as a representation of the self, he lacks certain features that form part of the empirically known symbolism of the self. The heart of Jesus, depicted as the center of a mandala, functions as a quaternary symbol of the self, and it is therefore no coincidence that it gradually became the object of specific ritual veneration. Various medieval illustrations place the heart of Jesus at the center of a typical mandala, while his hands and feet, pierced by nails, occupy the four corners. Within the heart itself, A small child carrying a scourge and a wand personifies the divine wisdom dwelling in Christ's heart. In a 15th century woodcut, only the upper half of Christ's body is represented as hanging on the cross, the lower half replaced by a large heart from which blood flows into a chalice held by 2 kneeling angels. The heart is depicted 4 more times, once in each corner. In the first, pierced by an arrow. In the second, encircled by a crown of thorns. In the third, pierced by Longinus' lance and 3 nails. And in the fourth, winged, with the moon within it and the sun hovering above between the wings. This motif emphasizes the essence of human feeling in Christ, highlighting a feminine element, in the form of wisdom, pressing forward for recognition, as also represented in the chalice, the moon within the heart, and other images. Invocations addressed to the divine heart of Jesus likewise reflect this feminine element. The heart is extolled as the temple in which dwells the life of the world, as a rose, a cup, a treasure, a spring, the furnace of divine love, ever glowing in the fire of the Holy Ghost, a censer and a bridal chamber. Jesus receives the souls of the dying into his heart, which burns glowingly, as red gold burns and melts in the fire, and the soul dissolves within it, as water mixes with wine. All of these symbols are feminine, closely connected with motifs of the Grail legend and alchemical symbolism. In that era, the wounding of Christ's heart by Longinus' spear was also understood as a wounding by an arrow of love. A High German woodcut, dating between 1470 and 1490, shows the Lady Charity, with averted countenance, sending arrow after arrow into the heart of the King of Heaven, while Horatio, another female figure, collects the flowing blood in a vessel. In a 14th century hymn, Jesus says to the soul, "With an arrow of love, O my bride, hast thou wounded my heart, which is why, out of love for thee, I am fastened to the wood of the cross." In a 13th century sermon, the Lord says to the soul, "Inasmuch as I was dead and hung upon the cross, out of love for thee I allowed my heart to be opened with a sharp lance. For thy sake I became a poor stranger. Give me now thy heart, which I have sought here on earth." It is as if Christ's human nature can be most clearly understood through reference to his heart. The image of the Melusine in the Pandora represents a darker variant of the figure of charity. It draws attention further into purely human nature, where divine love is intertwined with earthly love. While Lady Charity embodies the light, the Melusine reflects the natural, ambiguous aspect of the anima. Yet even she, as a manifestation of the dark unconscious human psyche with its innate drive toward individuation, aims at the heart of Christ. All these depictions illustrate the tendency of the unconscious to shift the highest value from the conventional aspects of Christ toward his essential quality as anthropos, or the second Adam, seen as a more complete symbol of the self. At the same time, insofar as the wounding instrument is reinterpreted as an arrow of love, the sharpness of ethical discrimination transforms into an attitude of understanding eros. Christ's blood, like his heart, symbolizes his essential quality, the psychic reality of his image, at which the alchemical anthropos figure, Mercurius, or the Melusine, takes aim. The symbolism of alchemy generally served as a receptacle for contents in a compensatory and complementary relationship to official Christianity, which explains the close connections between alchemy and Grail symbolism. The Christian era, coinciding with the astrological age of the fishes, is marked by the problem of opposites, Christ and Antichrist, light and dark, good and evil, reaching a level of intensity previously unseen. A notable shift in perspective occurred during the Christian aeon of the fishes. Until the year 1000, the period of the first fish, Christianity extended unilaterally. After the year 1000, however, various movements inspired by the Holy Spirit emerged, including those led by Joachim of Flores and other sects such as the Neo-Manichaeans, the Albigenses, the Pauvres de Lyon, and the spiritually kindred Occidental alchemy. All of these movements exhibit affinities with the Grail legend. Scholars have sought connections between the Grail story and the Catharists, Joachim of Flores, and Hermeticism, but these links appear limited to isolated points, insufficient to explain the entirety of the Grail narrative. It is therefore more probable that the roots of the story lie in unconscious psychological constellations, as described in depth in the study of archetypal patterns. In all of these movements, there was a pronounced concern with the problem of evil, the nature of the feminine, and the divine within the individual, expressed in a way that sought to supplement aspects that had previously been neglected in Christianity. The natural symbols of psychic wholeness, or the self, do not fully coincide with the traditional figure of Christ, since the shadow is absent in the latter or appears separated into the contrasting figure of the Antichrist. In alchemy, however, the image of the anthropos, or Son of Man, was continually expanded from its earliest appearance. Through the images of the lapis and mercurius, it evolved into a paradoxical symbol of the self in which opposites were reconciled. Because alchemy preserved certain living aspects of the symbolism of the self that were not incorporated into Christian dogma, the continued presence of some pre-Christian elements, the contents of paganism that had not yet lost their psychic value, was maintained. Similarly, the Grail story reflects this broadening of religious symbols, incorporating elements from late antiquity, Gnosticism, and Islam. It is therefore natural that poets drew upon Oriental legends as amplifications. Even versions of the story with a Christian emphasis can be traced to apocryphal writings containing legendary material from antiquity and the East. In the Lancelot Grail, in the works of Robert de Boron, and in the Quest, many motifs, including the legend of Solomon, appear alongside Celtic elements. The legend of Joseph of Arimathea, based on the Gospel of Nicodemus, was widely known at the time. Joseph of Arimathea was particularly venerated in Lorraine, not far from Montbéliard and the nearby village of Boron, the reputed birthplace of Robert, which may have influenced his selection of material. The return to Celtic and Germanic mythological motifs, alongside certain apocryphal traditions of early Christianity, can all be understood psychologically as stemming from the same need, to complete the image of Christ by adding features that ecclesiastical tradition had insufficiently accounted for. Further motifs and possible influences trace even further back to the legend of Alexander in late antiquity, containing details that recall the Grail story in a strikingly similar way. In this narrative, Alexander, on his march to India, encounters a mountain with 2,500 sapphire steps leading to its summit. At the top, he discovers the House of the Sun, a magnificent palace with doors and windows of gold. Nearby is a golden temple adorned with a golden vine bearing grapes of precious stones at its gate. Inside the temple, a beautiful white-haired old man lies on a golden couch, richly robed and nourished solely on incense and balm. He asks Alexander whether he wishes to see the holy trees of the sun and moon and consult them about his future. Close to these prophetic trees, which foretell Alexander's early death, stands another tree without leaves or blossoms, upon which sits a phoenix bird colored purple and gold. The same story appears in the German poem about Alexander by the Parson Lamprecht, though in this version the beautiful old man is asleep, and Alexander, not daring to awaken him, retraces his steps. All of these poems ultimately derive from the legend of Alexander recorded in the novel of Pseudo-Callisthenes, likely written in Alexandria around the beginning of the 3rd century. This text includes a letter from Alexander to his mother, which recounts, Alexander and his companions sailed away from the river and reached a large island, 150 stades from the mainland, where they found a city of the sun, with 12 towers of gold and emerald. At the center of the city was an altar made of gold and emerald with 7 steps, atop which stood a chariot with horses and a charioteer of gold and emerald. Due to the fog, the full splendor could not be seen clearly. The priest of the sun, an Ethiopian, instructed them to depart. Turning back, they arrived at the Sea of Lysus and found a high mountain. Climbing to its summit, they observed beautiful houses of gold and silver and a great city wall of sapphire with 100 steps. Inside and outside were statues of demigods, bacchantes, satyrs, and initiates, while the old Marin, a Silenus-type figure, sat upon a beast of burden. At the temple center was a bed where a man clothed in silk lay. His face was not visible, but his size and strength were apparent. A transparent golden crown hung from a chain, and a precious stone lit the temple in place of a fire. A golden cage containing a large bird also hung from the ceiling. The bird, speaking in a human-like voice, warned Alexander, "Desist henceforth from setting yourself against the gods. Return home and do not, through recklessness, hasten your passage to the heavenly paths." This story contains elements that closely parallel motifs in the Grail legend, particularly the image of the beautiful, white-haired old man reclining on a sumptuous bed. He resembles the Grail King, described in nearly identical terms as white-haired, beautiful, magnificently clothed, and lying on a couch. The old man in Alexander's tale is nourished solely by incense and balm, similar to the Grail King, who is sustained by the Grail and feeds only upon the host. Incense and balm function as the fragrant foods of the gods. The palace is named the House of the Sun, and there is a temple along with the holy trees of the sun and moon, suggesting a sacred place of worship and evoking associations with paradise. In the Grail narrative, Joseph, during his wanderings with the Grail, arrives in the town of Serres, the home of the Saracens, where a temple of the sun is also described. In Alexander's letter, the location is clearly depicted as a sacred site imbued with a numinous presence. The beautiful man is described as very large and strong, with his face obscured, appearing as a sleeping god or a moving statue of a deity. The vine, the statues of bacchantes, satyrs, and initiates, as well as the figure of the old Marin, point to Dionysus, who, under the name Zagreus, was central to the Orphic mysteries, linking the story to Orpheus, whose name translates as fisher. The Grail King is called the rich fisher, and later Orpheus the fisher became, like Christ, the Good Shepherd. In another aspect, he was also identified with the vine, establishing a close connection to the Grail. Additionally, the description of a precious stone, which lit the whole temple, taking the place of a fire, evokes the great hall of the Grail Castle, where a fire burned perpetually before the Grail King's couch, and the Grail itself emitted such brilliance that candlelight was dimmed. This also recalls Wolfram's depiction of the Grail as a stone. The numerous parallel motifs suggest that the authors who elaborated the Grail story may have drawn, at least in part, from the legend of Alexander, which had been translated into Latin in the 4th century and was widely known at the time. Another widely known and popular legend of the time, containing a similar depiction of a magnificent temple palace, was that of Prester John, which bore many resemblances to the story of Alexander. In this account, the temple tomb in India where Thomas the Apostle was buried is described as a splendid palace of gold and precious stones, illuminated by 2 carbuncles. The Apostle himself, with red hair and beard, lay uncorrupted in the tomb, appearing as fresh as if asleep, occasionally moving his hand when devout worshippers brought offerings. Scholars have suggested that the idea of the Grail Castle, particularly as described in the later Ticherel, may have come to Europe from Persia. This castle or temple, structured in a mandala-like form, represents paradise or a spiritual beyond, with its prototype seen in the Parsi sanctuary of the Holy Fire at Sis. It embodies the pattern of a royal tomb as well as a sanctuary at the center of the world, functioning as an image of the universe. Its structure has also been compared to Western mandalas and to the mountain sanctuary of the Muslim sect of the Assassins, a secret brotherhood under the authority of an old man of the mountain, with whom the Templars maintained particularly close relations. The Iranian sanctuary at Sis was rebuilt under the Muslim rulers following Genghis Khan's successors, one of whom, Abaka Khan, assumed the title of Priest King John, or Prester John. Wolfram von Eschenbach and the author of the later Ticherel explicitly link the legend of Prester John with the story of the Grail Temple. Even if the precise historical and literary connections are not always indisputable, the enormous stimulation of a Centrum Mundi fantasy, combining Christian elements with widely disseminated traditions from antiquity, the East, and Celtic sources, is undeniable. It appears that there was a deep psychic need to amplify the symbol of the self with many natural and cosmic features. Another influential set of ideas from antiquity that likely shaped the Grail story is the myth of Osiris, to be considered in due course. All of these descriptions, from the City of the Sun in Alexander's tale to Thomas the Apostle's sepulchre in the Prester John legend, present a clear picture of what is unmistakably a mandala, a symbol of the self. Significantly, in the legend of Alexander, the limitations of the young conqueror are highlighted each time he encounters the symbol. He is turned back from the City of the Sun, and when he nears the old man in the temple, a bird with a human voice calls to him, "Alexander, desist henceforth from setting thyself up against the gods." Similarly, in the Historia de Prelius and in the French versions, his death is foretold. Here, the self, as the inner guide, serves to restrain the man striving for Olympus, returning him to human proportions. A parallel can be drawn to Perceval, who is expelled from the Grail Castle and can only find it again after attaining the necessary maturity. The remarkable enrichment of the Grail story through Celtic and Oriental symbolism, as well as through the symbolism of antiquity, is a phenomenon of its age, finding a parallel in medieval alchemy. Alchemy, as shown, functioned as an undercurrent that compensated for and supplemented the gaps and conflicts in the Christianity that dominated the surface of society. Many alchemists themselves compared their sought for substance, the philosopher's stone, to Christ, establishing a parallel to him, and in doing so, unconsciously felt that their work was a continuation of Christ's redemptive activity. Had they been fully conscious of this, they would have realized that they were, in effect, stepping into the position of Christ, since their work of redeeming the Spirit of God in matter could only succeed under the guidance of the self, the inner Christ. Yet, they did not become aware that Christ is ultimately a symbol of the self. In the story, Perceval, like the alchemists, is called to a particular work of redemption, which places him in a mysterious, secret historical relation to Christ. He must carry the process of consciousness further in the Christian age, confronting questions about the origin of evil, the mystery of the Grail King's wounding by an enemy, and the meaning of the Grail itself. He must discover the significance of the vessel that contains the blood of the crucified one, and uncover how the essential psychic life of Christ continues to exist and what it represents. These links to the historical past and to central symbols of Christianity place the objects in the Grail procession within a broad, transpersonal psychological framework. Viewed from this perspective, Perceval's development is not only the story of one individual coming to consciousness, but also a symbolic representation of collective evolution conditioned by the era. Seen in this light, Perceval himself becomes a symbol and embodies archetypal content. His destiny, shaped by a long ancestral line to achieve the redemption of the Grail Kingdom, together with the essential authenticity of his nature and the traits of the fairy tale hero he embodies, suggests that he should be interpreted as an anthropos figure. Like the Mercurius figure of alchemy, he compensates for and amplifies the Christ image that dominates collective consciousness. He parallels the alchemical Homo altus or Homo quadratus, the true and complete human, the divine component in man, which gradually emerges from the depths of the unconscious maternal womb and reactivates areas of the psyche previously cut off from life. Of particular interest in relation to alchemy is the name of Perceval's ancestor, Uther Pendragon, interpreted as Dragon's Head. In alchemy, the dragon is regarded as the prima materia of the lapis. In the old text scriptum Alberti super arborem Aristotelis, 8 concentric circles are described, corresponding to the celestial spheres. The 4th circle contains an evil dragon emerging from the planets, and the 5th is called the head and the death of the dragon. This head lives in eternity and is known as the Vita Gloriosa, served by angels. Here, the dragon's head is clearly equated with Christ, for the service of angels unmistakably recalls the biblical account in which Christ repels Satan. If the dragon's head represents Christ, then the tail corresponds to the Antichrist or the devil. The dragon opposes the Imago Dei, but through God's might, this divine image is implanted in the dragon, forming its head. The whole body obeys the head, and the head hates the body, slaying it from the tail by gnawing with its teeth until the entire body enters the head and remains there forever. The dragon's head is thus the substance from which the philosopher's stone originates. It is significant that Perceval's ancestor is called Uther Pendragon, Dragon's Head, establishing Perceval as a parallel to the alchemical lapis, or to the purest and simplest man, whom the alchemists identified with their stone and regarded as a redeemer of the macrocosm. When Perceval faces the riddle of the Grail, he must bring his own psychic problems and extensive inner nature into consciousness. The sphere he must redeem, the Grail Castle, connects him with apocryphal contents representing the psychic background of Christian symbols, that is, the collective unconscious. A group of archetypal images has crystallized around the figure of the historical Jesus, which itself is scarcely discernible, effectively turning Christ into a symbol of the self. Among these images are the fish, the lamb, and the cross. This amplification of the Christ image proceeded with greater freedom in near-Christian traditions of the Middle Ages than in official dogmatic pronouncements. Fantasies, feelings, and new insights emerging from the unconscious were more likely to find expression, so that the living essence of Christ, especially his blood, persisted and developed further in these interpretations. Perceval can be seen as the embodiment of the natural human being confronted with the problem of evil and the relation to the feminine, and through these challenges, tasked with a greater development of his own consciousness. Through a circuitous and demanding journey, he ultimately achieves the redemption of the Grail kingdom, of which he becomes the ruler. It is significant that the land requiring redemption is linked to the early days of Christianity, when the Christ image was crystallizing from the collective unconscious and, by focusing exclusively on the light, was simultaneously casting off its shadow, represented by the Antichrist. The Grail story appears to represent a further enrichment of the symbol of the self, drawn from the same unconscious matrix, aiming to reconcile the opposing forces that had long been divided. In this process, the individual human being functions as a vessel, for it is only when the opposites are reconciled within a single person that true unity can occur. The individual thus becomes a receptacle for transforming the tension of opposites into the image of God. With this understanding, it becomes clear that each human being represents a site of transformation, a vessel in which the divine may become conscious. This brings the discussion to the central theme of the story, the Grail. The exploration of the Grail motif and its deeper psychological and symbolic significance will continue in the next discussion, where the journey into this legend is further pursued.